JordsWoodShop is sponsored by Minimax and by I Would Like. Check out their products at iwouldlike.com. Okay, because the polyurethane glue takes so long to dry, we might as well move on to getting our blade, which is the most delicate part of our paddle, fiberglass. So we're not going to fiberglass the shaft, we're just going to fiberglass pretty much up to here, and that will help prevent this from getting dents and dings and also chipping bits of wood off when you whack your rail. So because we want to stop the glass, we're going to use some masking tape. Get the good quality stuff, you'll be thankful for it when it comes to removing it. And just make sure that your seam is pretty nice. So that's a nice tight seam, so you shouldn't get too much creep underneath there. Now the glass fill I'm going to be using for this paddle is 4-ounce cloth, and that's what I use on my wooden boards. Sometimes you double up the layers, but I think for a paddle, 4 to 6 ounce cloth is probably all you need. Obviously the heavier cloth gives you the more protection. So here I'm just going to cut off a strip, and that's going to be enough for our blade. So with the cloth, I cut 2 very rough shaped sizes because when it's actually laying on the paddle and we've brushed it out, that's when we actually trim it to its final size. So with our very roughly shaped cloth, we've just got to lay it on the blade like so, and we'll be trimming it to size. So around the knuckle here, because we're not fiberglassing that and we don't really want it to move around too much, I'm actually going to add a little bit of tape. You don't really need to do this, but it does just make life a little bit easier for the next step. I've taken my glove off because it's really hard to pat the glass out with rubber gloves. But here we're just patting the glass out really gently, trying to get it to sit nicely over this paddle, and that's looking pretty good. So now I'm just going to come in with some sharp scissors and trim the glass to be nice and close to that lip. Okay, now the resin I'm using is the West Systems epoxy. So with the West Systems, it's mixed to a 1:5 ratio by volume or weight. Okay, so with that resin, we just mix it up, making sure to rub down the sides, get it really well mixed. Now I'm using fast because this is such a small item to glass, but if it's something larger, you obviously want to use the slow hardener. And the thing with epoxy is it's an exothermic sort of reaction where it sets. So if you keep it in this cup for too long, it's going to start setting up a lot quicker because it's actually retaining the heat. So the sooner you pour your epoxy onto the item you're glassing, the longer working time you're actually going to have. So once it's nice and mixed, it's a good idea to get it onto your workpiece as fast as possible. See, I can already feel it in my hands heating up, and it's not even been a minute. So nice even pour in the middle, and you just work from the center out. Now with a brush on the edges of the rail, I'm just going to poke the edges here and get it to stick to the side. Now once this coat's dry, we'll actually cut off the excess, sand the other side, we'll tape off, and then do the exact same process for the reverse side of this paddle. So we should have a really nice lamination after this is all said and done. So here you can see where I've got a little bit of the glass not wanting to stick, and that's just because I trimmed it a little bit too close to the rail and I haven't got enough glass there to actually stick. But On this first side of the lamination, that's not a big deal because we'll be masking off on this edge here and doing the second side shortly. Okay, so I let the first side dry for a few hours and I came back with a really sharp razor blade, so I took a brand new one out and I trimmed along the edges, so all that overhang is gone. And then with the resin that poured over the back side, I also sanded that off, so I'm left with a nice flat form. So now we can go on to fiberglassing the second side of the blade, but we've got an extra precaution here, and that is we want to tape off this freshly glassed side. So what I've got here is some high quality blue tape, and I'm just going to pretty much mask off everything I don't want to have fiberglass go onto. So with the actual edge of the blade, I do want there to be a little bit of an overlap, so it's pretty much the face of the blade which I'm masking off, not the rail, or not the edge. Now the smoother you can get the actual line with the tape, the less work you're going to have with the actual sanding, but with such a small paddle, sanding this with 600 grits until it's, the transition is smooth, isn't going to take you very long at all. So you don't need to be so worried about it that you spend 2 hours on your tape job. But the closer you get it, the better you're going to have, well, the better time you're going to have later. Now, as this side we want to actually overlap and lap onto that tape line, we're going to be cutting our cloth here to be a little bit more oversized, I guess you would say. Okay, so that's looking good. So I just cut this mat a little bit wider than before. So now I'll just brush that mat out. You can use a really soft bristle brush to do the same thing, and it does get a slightly better result, but for me, my hands are a pretty good tool. Now on the end here, I'm just going to cut a few relief cuts, and hopefully that will ensure that we get a nice clean wrap around our rail here. Now the difference with the paddle facing up here, we've obviously got gravity working against us, so I'm going to pour my resin up high. That should streak down, and then I'll spread it out from the top, working my way down, and then do the sides. Okay, so catch the resin and try and spread it out. So here I'm just brushing on a bit of resin to the rails, working my way out. That's just wetting the glass, and that will allow me to get a fairly nice lamination, and hopefully it will cut back on the amount of air bubbles that may form. Okay, so just brushing that rail smooth, and that's looking good. Now any of that overrun that we have, we'll just come back with our spreader or our applicator and either even it out or actually squeegee it off. Okay, and that's a really good looking lamination. We've got a nice tight rail, or edge I should say, and the face of the paddle is really flat. There's no pooling, and tomorrow, once this is all set up, we'll be able to actually do a really good top coat, which will give it a really nice gloss, and also fill out all of those little seams that we have, which we have to cut away and then sand back. So we're going to let this set up overnight, and I'll be back tomorrow to finish this paddle off. To finish this paddle off, we're going to do a full coat of epoxy all over it. But before we can do that, we just got to clean up this underside of the paddle. So with a sharp razor blade, I'm just going to trim off anything that is kind of hanging high, and then we'll sand it back. So what I'm doing here is called a zipper cut, and it's essentially lifting the tape, which has the fiberglass glued onto it, and running the blade along the paddle to cut the fiberglass fibers. Usually get a pretty clean result, but we will be sanding this back a little bit, so it's not too bad if you don't get it all. Now then, along the neck where we did our tape line, we want to cut through all the fiberglass, so we're just going to use the length of the blade and rotate the paddle until we're cutting into the wood, and that will give us a really nice seam. And by using the length of the blade, I tend to get a straighter cut instead of the tip. So that's a really nice clean seam there. And here I'll just continue doing my zip cuts until we have a nice clean paddle. Excess fiberglass, and it's not looking too bad. The back's really good, the neck's really good, but along our tape line we do have a bit of cleanup to do still. So obviously a little bit of resin creeped in under it all, and that's not a big deal. So what I've got is some 180 grit wet dry sandpaper, and all we're going to do is sound the edges until we have a nice clean transition, and all of these ugly bits of blue tape that are left here are gone. Okay, so that seam's looking pretty good. So now, while I've still got the sandpaper out, I'm just going to give it all a really quick light sanding, just in case there's any high spots or somewhere that dust fell into. We'll just get rid of those high spots, and it should be good. The thing with fiberglass like this, you're not going to get it smooth because you have the weave of the mat. It's just about getting rid of the high spots. So you're just kind of going over it really lightly, and if you feel anything that's kind of sticking up, that's where you want to hit. If you try and get it smooth, you're not actually going to have any glass left on your piece. That's what the next coat of resin's for. That's to actually get it super smooth and feeling good. To finish off the fiberglassing and also the rest of the paddle, we've just got to put a couple of coats of just epoxy, so no more glass. The paddle suspended from the roof here, so I can do it all in one go. And essentially the only difference between this and the actual fiberglassing is, instead of using a spreader, we're going to use a good quality brush and apply a fairly generous coat all over the paddle, making sure that we don't get any runs. So we should be able to get this done in 2 coats and be on the water. Okay, so there we have it, a beautifully handcrafted paddle, and I can tell you I'm really happy with the way this one's come out. Now I've still got a little bit of work to do with the resin, so once it's cured for a few more days, I'll have to come back with 1000 grit sandpaper, just give it a quick sanding, buff it all out so it's nice and smooth and doesn't have any of these little kind of divots you see in the light. But other than that, it's ready for the water.